60s, Linux and Horizon to build moon bases. The Soviets had Zvezda. They wanted to build a moon base. Everybody wanted to build a moon base. And you look at it and you think to yourself, okay, there's enough evidence here that there's something going on. And so once I got to that, then I started to look at more exotic stuff within Alternative 3. So one of the things that they talk about is this notion of batch consignments, that you basically kidnap people and send them to the moon or Mars to be slave labor. And I thought, well, that's nuts. How do you kidnap enough people to be your slave labor force, right? Well, it turns out that in lesser developed parts of the world, entire villages vanish and nobody knows where they went. Okay, maybe they're just poor and moving around to try to find more food. I studied anthropology. I know about subsistence patterns. Okay, maybe that's kind of shaky. And then I read David Pauli's work on Missing 411, and one of the things that I did is that he has a map where he puts little pins where everybody disappears.
Right.
I overlaid that on top of them. Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah.
You guys still hear me? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I overlaid that on top of a map from the early 90s by this guy, Tal. Tal said he had a map of all these underground bases and saucer bases and all this other stuff. So I overlaid the one on top of the other. I tried to match them the best I could, right? It's not 100%, but it's close enough to show you something. And I'll tell you what, if you look at Tal's map, around where he says these secret bases are, they're high concentration, at least in the West. There are high concentrations of disappearances. Now, I can't explain some of the other stuff that he found about people being abducted, people disappearing like 3 feet from another person. They turn up 4 miles away, running through the forest naked, and they have no idea where they are. I cannot explain that. But what I will say is that these groupings of disappearances seem to match where Tal put these secret bases.
Well, I will say one thing. There's been a hell of a lot of people that has gone missing in the national forest system,
right,
to the point where you can't say they just went out hunting and they shot themselves or they fell off a cliff. But it's been so many. I mean, we are talking a huge amount. And then not just that. How about people who decided, hey, let's go on a road trip and never end up anywhere? I mean, so many people are missing every day. It's to the point where it's crazy.
It's like 10,000 a day or something like that. Now, once I conquered that problem, right, and of course, I looked at, okay, you've got Bob Groden, who's a total stand-in for Buzz Aldrin, had an alcohol problem, went to the moon, saw crazy stuff, had an alcohol problem, married a couple times, brilliant scientist, trying to clean up his act. Okay, which, I love Buzz Aldrin. I think he's a great spokesman for the space program. I think now he's really amazing. But there was a hard time for him, and this was made during that hard time for him. And the guy that they had, and I wish he hadn't, because, he's a hero, right? I mean, he went to the moon, and it took a lot of guts. And I could not even imagine the amount of fear that I would have riding a ballistic missile in orbit. I just can't comprehend that. But him and Armstrong and all those guys in the Apollo program were very brave, and I think they are heroes. And I think they went up there and they were doing what they thought they were doing. But Bob Groden's a perfect stand-in for Buzz Aldrin in the late 70s, right? I mean, picture perfect. So I started to look at more and more, and then the whole idea of geoengineering came up, and this idea that Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, he had written an article for, I think, the New York Times or one of the larger publications of the time, talking about the sunscreen for the planet Earth. And I just saw a whole lot of things that started lining up. And then the kind of kicker for me is that when 9/11 happened, right, something interesting happened. That when it happened, a whole bunch of atmospheric scientists realized that this is the first time in recorded history that there is no there are no airplanes in the sky, right? That they had grounded everything. A very wise move. They had grounded everything. So these guys thought to themselves, well, I'll be damned. There's no planes. let's go take measurements. This is like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So a bunch of atmospheric scientists ran outside. They're floating balloons and taking measurements. And lo and behold, that what they discovered is that the amount of sunlight reaching the surface of the Earth was higher, and the Earth had started already heating up because there's nothing to abate the solar radiation from coming down. And what Teller had talked about doing with the sunscreen of the planet Earth was to create a film in the upper atmosphere that would change the reflectivity of the Earth and reflect a lot of the sunlight back out into space, or the radiation back into space, and lower the temperature of the Earth. Because, he believed, a lot of people believe, that we were having a greenhouse effect, and probably still are, right? But there seemed to be an indicator that this is actually the case, and they call it global dimming. And I'm sure you've noticed it. It's probably not severe enough that you think about it a lot, but I'm sure you've gone out every once in a while and you think to yourself, man, it seems darker than it used to, right?
Oh, yeah. Hey,
that's because it is.
I was just telling my wife that here a couple of weeks ago. I said, I remember, when back a few years ago, you go out like 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it was bright. And now it seems like it's like 1 or 2 o'clock seems more like about 3 o'clock. I mean, it's just the brightness isn't there, and the sunlight is not. You don't supposed to look at the sun, but I mean, if you kind of halfway take a look at it, it doesn't seem as bright. Have you noticed that too, Michael?
Yeah. Well, yes, and this is an interesting subject that might hook into this chemtrail thing that's going on as well. What do you think of that?
Exactly. Well, that's basically, I call it Alternative 1.5, and that's basically a massive geoengineering program to try to control the temperature of the Earth. And the way that I don't believe that the pilots know what it is. I don't believe that there's a massive chemtrail fleet, because the problem is you have to do it around the entire world. So how do you organize that and keep it secret? You can't. Some pilot somewhere, or some crew chief somewhere, somebody somewhere is eventually going to get drunk at a bar, and they're going to tell the guy next to them, hey, guess what I do for a living? You can't keep a secret. So my contention is that whatever is up there, right, that is causing this to happen is actually mixed into the fuel. I think they mix it into the fuel. And then it just happens with every plane, because it's indiscriminate. You can't pick a plane. I've watched, and you know how people say, well, it's a chemtrail plane. You know what? I've watched a Virgin America plane fly right over my house, because I'm on a flight path. I've watched them fly right over my house. There's no contrail at all. And then I watch a Delta plane fly pretty much the same direction, east, and hey, there's a contrail. Oh, and look, that contrail's not dissipating. And there's a Singapore Airlines 747 that's going north, that's flying way above him, right? And, he has a contrail that's dissipating. So I think they just mix it into batches of fuel, and then it basically turns every airplane on the surface, or on the face of the Earth, into part of the chemtrail fleet. They don't talk about it. And you can actually, in the books, I show graphs where it shows the amount of heat and the amount of light that's getting to the surface of the Earth. And you see there's a kind of high point, and then you see it start to drop and drop and drop, and then it'll spike, and then it'll drop and it'll spike. And some of those spikes are caused by, natural disasters or atmospheric changes, and you can actually see where they're correcting and where they're not correcting. And the other thing that you see that's interesting is that as this has gone on longer and longer, then you start to see a rise in things like autism, and you start to see a rise in things like Alzheimer's disease. These seem to follow the same ebb and flow pattern of the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, right? So, I think that it's like anything else, right? That you're going to do something for the benefit of the greater good, but sometimes some people are more susceptible or less susceptible, and it can have different kinds of impacts on each individual, because you can't predict that. So I think that there is a correlation between various things that we seem to see a rise in, and the amount of the stuff that they're dumping to try to control the temperature. Now, the one thing that's interesting about alternatives, go ahead.
I just think it could turn around and bite us in the butt and backfire. You know, all these...
Well, that's what I'm about to tell you.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No problem. So one of the things that the people don't know is that when you have climate change, right? And I don't know many people who resist the notion of climate change. I think there's groups of people that say, well, we did it, and there are groups of people that say it's natural. And I'm of the mindset that it's both. But assuming that the climate change is real, and it is at least somewhat impacted by us, which I think is rational, people always focus on the idea that the world is going to heat up and turn into a cinder block, and that's not entirely true, right? That as we're messing with it, the Earth is naturally trying to counteract it, right? And what apparently happens, except in places like Venus where it's a runaway greenhouse effect, what can happen is that when certain functional elements of the ecology, like the conveyor belt, for example, when those things break down because of climate change, that it dramatically changes areas of weather. And when that happens, you run the risk of plunging yourself into an ice age. And so although, in the near term, maybe our summers are hotter. I mean, I think it was last year, I was walking one of my children to school, and they had a one of those signs, and it showed you what the temperature was. It was like 130 degrees. I've lived here most of my life. I've never seen it be that hot.
Well,
and you guys know that when they take the temperature, they take it in the shade. So, this thing was in direct sunlight, so 130 degrees, more like 120 degrees. This year, I went to pick him up around the same time, and it's like 72 degrees. So things are changing, right? It's unstable.
And it's changing fast because, 2 months ago,
it is.
Michael, I don't, you probably remember it, even up here in the Tacoma Gig Harbor area. Okay, we broke a record 2 years ago. We hit 72 degrees, and that was the record. Then, 2 months ago, we hit 91, 92 degrees for one day.
Right.
Totally crazy. And it's also funny, where I live, when I moved here 20 years ago, I have a little mini farm.
Uh-huh.
I got a pond and all this stuff with fish in it. It would freeze solid for like a month or more during the winter. Mm-hmm. Then in the last couple of years, the freezing, it maybe freeze an inch deep, and then it lasts maybe a couple of weeks. Then the last couple of years, it would only freeze maybe a quarter inch deep. This past year, it got a layer of ice on it, maybe an eighth of an inch thick, and it was gone within a couple of days, and it would freeze up again like that and gone a couple of days. I got a big flight of wood stairs going to my house. It would ice up and it'd be dangerous. The last 2 years, I haven't even had to worry about it.
Well, I talked to a farmer probably 7 years ago, and he was telling me that they in commercial farms, they employ climatologists to do the weather forecast for the crop seasons. And he was saying, he was in the Midwest, and he was saying that the climatologist actually came back to him and said that basically the weather has shifted, I think, 80 miles north. So he was actually getting weather that should have been 80 miles to his south, which was fantastic for him, because during October and November, I guess they call it Octovember, they do a lot of harvesting, and they had to, prior to this happening, they had to actually use massive propane heaters out in the fields to keep the plants from icing over and destroying the crop. And he said that, they didn't have to do that anymore. And he was so happy because every year he would spend, I think, like $140,000 on propane. He's like, I don't have to spend $140,000 anymore. But what it shows you is that even 7 years ago, he was already seeing it, and he was happy because it extended his growing seasons and it made it more lucrative and whatever. But for the rest of us, I walk down the block and it's 130 degrees.
Well, it's unstable.
But
The weather is unstable right now. I mean, where I live, you know, we should be having nice weather day after day right now this time of year.